Imagine two people, same age, same income, same starting capital. One of them spends hours every week watching market news, reading analyst reports, refreshing their brokerage app, waiting for the perfect moment to invest. They're disciplined, they're patient, they're careful. The other one? They set up an automatic transfer on the first of every month, put it into a boring index fund, and then completely forget about it. No news, no charts, no strategy sessions. You'd assume the first person is the smart investor, right? You'd assume all that research, all that patience, all that caution would pay off. But here's the kicker. After 20 years, the second person, the one who did almost nothing, ends up with significantly more money. And the first person? Still waiting for the right moment. Still watching. Still not fully invested. That feels completely backwards. Why would doing less produce more? Why would inaction actually be one of the most dangerous financial decisions you can make? That's exactly what we're going to break down today.
Let me introduce you to three people. Same starting point, same income, same time horizon. Very different approaches. First, meet Petra Perfect. Petra has an almost supernatural ability to time the market. Every single year, she waits patiently, reads the charts, studies the macro environment, and invests at the absolute lowest point of the year. The perfect entry, every time. Then there's Warren Waiting. Warren is smart, cautious. He reads the news obsessively and always feels like the market is too expensive right now. So he waits, and waits, and waits. His money sits in cash, earning minimal interest, while he looks for the right moment that never quite arrives. And finally, meet Betty Bad Timing. Betty has one rule: invest consistently no matter what. The problem? She always seems to pick the worst possible moment. Every lump sum she invests lands right at the market peak, right before a major crash. Her timing is so bad it almost seems intentional. These three people represent real choices that real investors make every single day. And the results, backed by more than 2 decades of data, are going to completely change how you think about investing. But first,
But before we get into it, a quick disclaimer. This is not financial advice. Everything we discuss today is purely for educational purposes. Always do your own research and, if needed, consult a qualified financial professional before making any investment decisions. Now, the idea that doing nothing is dangerous sounds almost absurd when you first hear it. We're conditioned by media, by culture, by our own instincts to believe that action equals progress, that monitoring equals control, that waiting equals safety. Think about it in everyday life. If you're sick, you don't just sit there. You see a doctor, you take medicine, you do something. If your car makes a strange noise, you don't ignore it. You bring it in for a check. The default assumption is that attention and action lead to better outcomes than passivity. And in most areas of life, that's absolutely correct. But investing is one of the very few domains where this instinct completely breaks down, where the appearance of control, checking the portfolio, reacting to news, timing the market, often destroys value instead of creating it, where the biggest threat to your financial future isn't a market crash, isn't inflation, and isn't even bad stock picks. It's you. More specifically, it's your behavior. And here's what makes this so difficult to accept. The damage doesn't look like damage. Waiting doesn't feel like losing. Watching doesn't feel like falling behind. It feels responsible. It feels prudent. It feels like exactly what a careful person would do. But the data tells a completely different story.
Let's start with Wesley. Wesley's strategy, moving in and out of the market based on conditions, has a name. It's called market timing, and researchers have studied it extensively. In a landmark study, Charles Schwab analyzed investor returns over a 20-year period from 2003 to 2022. They looked at 5 different investor archetypes and measured what happened to a $2,000 annual investment under different strategies. The results were striking. The investor who invested immediately at the start of each year, regardless of market conditions, ended up with around $151,000. The investor who used dollar-cost averaging, spreading that $2,000 across the year in monthly installments, ended up with roughly $135,000. And the investor who stayed in cash, waiting for the perfect moment, around $44,000. That's not a small gap. That's a gap of more than $100,000 over a 2-decade period, simply because one person kept waiting while the other kept investing. Now let's talk about Patricia and the real cost of sitting on the sidelines. Hartford Funds conducted a study examining what happens when investors miss just the best days in the market. Looking at a 20-year period of S&P 500 returns, they found that if you missed only the 10 best days in those 2 decades, your returns were cut by more than half. Missed the 20 best days, your returns dropped by roughly 75%. And here's what makes this especially painful. Those best days, the ones that did the heavy lifting, often cluster right around the worst days. The market tends to rebound sharply after major sell-offs, which means that investors like Patricia, who exit the market during scary moments and wait for stability before re-entry, are almost systematically guaranteed to miss the very days that matter most. You can't time your way around this. The math simply doesn't work in your favor. But what about Danny? Is doing almost nothing really the winning strategy? Researchers at Archbridge analyzed long-term returns for investors in the S&P 500 going back to 1990. What they found consistently was that time in the market, the sheer number of years you are invested, was a more powerful driver of outcomes than almost any tactical decision an investor could make. The compounding effect, when left uninterrupted, is almost mechanically reliable over long enough time horizons. The data strongly suggests that Danny, with his boring automatic investment and zero market watching.
So, if the data is this clear, if research consistently shows that time in the market beats timing the market, why do so many people still behave like Wesley and Patricia? This is where psychology becomes the most important variable in investing. The first culprit is loss aversion. This is one of the most well-documented cognitive biases in behavioral economics. Humans feel the pain of losing money approximately twice as intensely as we feel the pleasure of gaining the same amount. This means that every time the market dips, even temporarily, the emotional response is disproportionately strong. It feels rational to exit. It feels logical to protect what you have. Even when the data shows that staying invested produces better outcomes, the emotional pain of watching your portfolio drop overrides the intellectual argument for holding on. The second bias is regret aversion. Patricia isn't just afraid of losing money. She's afraid of making a decision that turns out to be wrong. If she invests today and the market drops next week, she'll feel responsible for that loss. But if she waits and the market goes up without her, somehow that feels less painful, even though she's left real money on the table. The psychology of regret makes inaction feel safer than action, even when the financial outcome of inaction is objectively worse. And then there's recency bias, our tendency to believe that whatever has been happening recently will continue to happen. When markets are falling, we extrapolate decline. When markets are rising fast, we worry they're too high. Both feelings push us toward the same behavior, not fully investing right now, always waiting for a better signal that never comes. These biases aren't a sign of stupidity, they're hardwired. They evolved in environments where caution and reactivity kept us alive. But the stock market doesn't.
So what's the practical answer here? The first step is accepting one foundational truth. You cannot consistently predict short-term market movements, and neither can anyone else. Not the analysts on television, not the fund managers with PhDs, not the macroeconomists with decades of experience. The evidence is overwhelming on this point. Trying to time the market is not a sophisticated strategy. It is a losing game played against a system that is, in aggregate, extraordinarily efficient at pricing in information. Once you accept that, the path forward becomes much simpler. Automate your investing. Set a fixed amount to be invested on a fixed schedule. Monthly works well for most people. And remove the decision from your hands entirely. This is dollar-cost averaging, and it's powerful not because it guarantees the best price, but because it guarantees consistent participation in market growth over time, regardless of how you feel on any given month. Stop watching daily. This sounds almost too simple, but the research is consistent. Investors who check their portfolios less frequently tend to make fewer emotional decisions and generate better long-term returns. Checking your portfolio every day doesn't give you control. It gives you anxiety and a higher likelihood of reacting to noise. Reframe what doing something means. The most productive action you can take as a long-term investor is often invisible. Staying invested during downturns, continuing contributions when the news is bad, resisting the urge to move to cash. These are active decisions. They require discipline and intention. The fact that they look like inaction from the outside is what makes them so psychologically difficult and so financially valuable. Like what Danny does month after month. He's not passive. He's consistently disciplined, which is a much harder thing to sustain than it looks.
Now, and this is important, none of what I've said today means that all inaction is good, or that you should invest without any strategy whatsoever. There are legitimate reasons to hold cash. If you have a major expense coming up within 2 to 3 years, a property purchase, a business investment, an emergency fund shortfall, that money should not be in equities. The time horizon matters enormously, and the advice to stay invested assumes you are investing capital you genuinely won't need in the short term. There's also the question of what you're invested in. Consistent investing in a highly concentrated or poorly diversified portfolio is not the same as consistent investing in a broad market index. Research from Rockefeller Capital has pointed out that the top 10 stocks now represent over 35% of the S&P 500 by weight, meaning that even diversified index investing in a US-only fund carries concentration risk that many investors don't fully appreciate. And if you're investing globally, T. Rowe Price has noted that the MSCI All-Country World Index includes thousands of companies across more than 40 countries, offering a fundamentally different risk profile than a US-only fund. Neither is wrong, but understanding the difference is part of investing with integrity. The goal isn't to turn your brain off entirely. The goal is to direct your analytical energy toward decisions that actually matter: asset allocation, savings rate, time horizon, and away from decisions that feel important but statistically aren't, like whether to wait until next month to invest because the market feels uncertain. I already have several videos on the channel covering index fund selection and global diversification in more detail. I'd recommend watching those after this one.
So let's bring this back to our 3 investors. Wesley, who monitors everything and acts on his instincts, is likely underperforming the market. Not because he's unintelligent, but because his intelligence is being applied to a problem that doesn't respond to intelligence in the way he expects. Patricia, who is still waiting for the right moment, has already paid a compounding cost for every month she stayed on the sidelines, even if it doesn't appear on any statement anywhere. And Danny, who is doing almost nothing, he's letting time and consistency do the work that most investors exhaust themselves trying to do manually. The single most dangerous financial habit isn't panic selling. It isn't picking bad stocks. It's the quiet, comfortable, responsible feeling act of waiting, of staying in cash just a little longer, of telling yourself you'll invest when things are clearer. Because things are never fully clear, and the cost of waiting compounds just as reliably as the returns you're missing. If this gave you something to think about, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially if you recognize yourself in Wesley or Patricia. You're definitely not alone. And if you found this helpful, consider subscribing. We put out new videos every week breaking down these concepts in a way that's actually actionable. See you in the next one.